mid-19th century, Europe was enjoying a relatively long period of peace after the devastating Napoleonic Wars. The Industrial Revolution was changing the face of the continent, promising an era of progress and prosperity. But beneath the surface of that peace, old conflicts and new ambitions were smoldering, ready to explode into a conflict that would signal the end of one age of war and the beginning of another. That conflict would take place not in the center of Europe, but on its fringes, on a remote peninsula in the Black Sea. It would be called the Crimean War. This was not simply a regional war. It was the first confrontation between European powers since Napoleon. It saw the collapse of the old system of alliances that had kept the peace and the birth of new hatreds. It has been called the first modern war, where railways and telegraphs, steam warships, and rifled artillery forever changed the face of the battlefield. And it began, not with a vast territorial dispute, but with a seemingly petty quarrel over the keys to a church in a faraway land. The Holy Land, then under the rule of the Muslim Ottoman Empire, was a place of pilgrimage for both Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. For centuries, Orthodox monks with Russian patronage had controlled most of the holy sites, including the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. But in 1851, a new ambitious leader came to power in France. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great Napoleon, had crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III in a coup. To bolster his prestige and win the support of conservative French Catholics, he decided to challenge Russian influence in the East. Napoleon III put strong diplomatic pressure on the Ottoman Sultan, Abdülmecid III, to hand over control of the holy places to French Catholic monks. The Sultan, fearful of the French naval power closing in on his shores, agreed. This decision caused a furor in St. Petersburg. For Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, this was not just a religious issue, but a direct affront to Russia's prestige and role as the protector of all Orthodox Christians. Nikolai then was an autocratic ruler who spent his reign suppressing revolution and maintaining a conservative order in Europe. He saw the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, a dying entity whose death was only a matter of time. For years, he had harbored ambitions to extend Russian influence southward, to seize Constantinople, Istanbul, and control the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits, thereby opening the way for the Russian Black Sea Fleet to the Mediterranean, a dream dating back to the time of Peter the Great. The dispute over the holy places provided Nicholas IV with the perfect excuse. He believed that now was the time to put decisive pressure on the sick man. He wanted not only to restore the rights of the Orthodox Church, but also to force the Sultan to formally recognize Russia's protectorate over the entire 12 million Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire. This, in effect, would allow the Tsar to intervene in Ottoman internal affairs at any time he wished. To make his demands, Nicholas sent a special envoy, Prince Alexander Menshikov, to Constantinople in early 1853. Menshikov acted arrogantly and tactlessly. He arrived on a warship dressed in military uniform rather than civilian clothes, and treated Ottoman ministers with contempt. He demanded a secret treaty recognizing Russia's protectorate, but he had not anticipated the intervention of another master diplomat, the British ambassador, Stratford Canning. Stratford Canning, a man with deep experience in Ottoman politics, recognized the danger in Russia's claim. Britain, with its vast empire, had always feared Russian expansion in Asia and the Mediterranean. It wanted to maintain the integrity of the Ottoman Empire as a buffer against Russia. Canning wisely advised Sultan Abdülmecid I accept small claims to the Holy Lands to appease France and Russia, but firmly reject the claim to protectorate as an unacceptable infringement on national sovereignty. The Sultan did so. Menshikov, humiliated, left Constantinople in anger. Feeling humiliated, Tsar Nicholas thus decided to act. In July 1853, Russian troops crossed the Pruth River and occupied the Ottoman vassal principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. Nicholas justified this action not as a war, but as a means of putting pressure on the Sultan to accept his demands. He made a serious error in calculation. He believed that Austria, which he had helped suppress the Hungarian Revolution of 1849, would be on his side. He also believed that Britain and France, two historical rivals, would never cooperate. He was wrong on both counts. Austria, fearful of Russian expansion in the Balkans, maintained a hostile neutrality, and more importantly, Russia's aggression brought Britain and France closer together. For Napoleon III, this was an opportunity to break France's diplomatic isolation and assert his position. For the British government under Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, Russia's actions were an unmitigated challenge to the European order and British interests in the East. Both countries sent their fleets to the Dardanelles to support the Ottomans. Although the great powers continued to seek a diplomatic solution, the flames of war were ignited by the Ottomans themselves. With the support of Britain and France, the Sultan issued an ultimatum demanding Russia's withdrawal. When Russia refused, the Ottomans declared war in October 1853. The first fighting broke out along the Danube, where the Ottomans surprisingly fought and repelled Russian attacks at Oltenitsa. But at sea, Russia's superiority was absolute. On November 30th, 1853, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, commanded by Admiral Nakhimov, discovered an Ottoman squadron sheltering from a storm in the port of Sinope. In a one-sided battle, the Russian fleet used its new explosive shells to great effect, completely destroying the Ottoman fleet. Nearly 3,000 Turkish sailors were killed. The Sinope Massacre, as the British press called it, caused a wave of outrage in London and Paris. It was seen as a brutal act and proof that Russia would not stop. Public pressure demanded action. In March 1854, after a final ultimatum demanding that Russia withdraw from the Principalities was ignored, Britain and France officially declared war on the Russian Empire. A conflict that had begun as a dispute over church keys had now become a full-scale war between the great powers. None of them could have predicted how long it would last, how many lives it would cost, and how it would forever change the way people wage war. The focus of the coming conflict will shift to a remote peninsula that few in Western Europe have ever heard of, Crimea, summer 1854. After Britain and France declared war, the initial phase of the war was rather disjointed. An Allied expeditionary force was sent to Varna, in modern-day Bulgaria, to support the Ottoman army, but it arrived too late. The Ottomans, in a stubborn defense, had themselves driven the Russians from Silistria and forced them to withdraw from the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. Austria, in a diplomatic move against Russia, marched into these principalities. The initial objective of the war seemed to have been achieved without any major Anglo-French battle, but political pressure in London and Paris demanded a clear military victory. To leave now would have been considered a humiliation. A new, bolder, and more dangerous objective was set: to strike at the heart of Russian power in the Black Sea. That was the naval fortress of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. The idea was risky. The Allied commanders had almost no intelligence about the strength of the fortifications at Sevastopol or the number of Russian troops on the peninsula. They had no detailed maps, no logistical plans for a prolonged campaign, and autumn was approaching. But the orders from home were clear. In September 1854, the Allied fleet, carrying more than 60,000 British, French, and Turkish troops, set sail for Crimea. It was the largest seaborne operation in history up to that point. The landings went unopposed, a major strategic blunder by the Russian commander, Prince Menshikov. But chaos reigned. With no harbor, everything had to be brought ashore by small boat. It began to rain, turning the beach into a quagmire. And worse, a cholera epidemic broke out, killing hundreds of soldiers before they even saw the enemy. After a few days, the Allies began their march south towards Sevastopol. Along the way, they encountered Menshikov's Russian army, which was occupying a strong defensive position in the hills behind the Alma River. The first major battle of the Crimean War was about to begin. The Battle of Alma, fought on September 20th, 1854, exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of the sides. The French, under Marshal Saint-Arnaud, made a daring attack, scaling the almost vertical cliffs and attacking the left flank of the Russian army, causing surprise. Meanwhile, the British, under Lord Raglan, made a frontal attack, crossing the Alma River under heavy fire. The British soldiers, known for their iron discipline, advanced in straight ranks, suffering heavy casualties but not flinching. The power of their new Minié rifles, with their long range, the superior fire, and accuracy of the Russian smoothbore muskets proved decisive. By the end of the day, the Russians had been driven from their positions and were forced to retreat in disarray towards Sevastopol. The victory at Alma opened the way to Sevastopol, but here the Allied commanders made a controversial mistake. Instead of immediately attacking the city from the north, where its defenses were weak, they decided to make a complex detour south to capture the ports of Balaclava and Kamiesh in order to secure supply lines for a long siege. And This decision gave the Russians valuable time to consolidate their lines, and the Russians took full advantage of that opportunity. Under the direction of a brilliant military engineer, Edward Totleben, an incredible defense system was built in just a few weeks. The Black Sea Fleet's battleships were scuttled at the entrance to the harbor to block the Allied fleet. Their guns and sailors were brought ashore to reinforce the fortifications. Sevastopol was transformed into a virtually impregnable fortress. The lightning attack that the Allies had hoped for now turned into the long and arduous siege. A battle of trenches and artillery foreshadowed what would happen on the Western Front 60 years later. In October, the Allies began their first bombardment of Sevastopol, but Totleben's earthworks proved surprisingly effective at absorbing the bombardment. Meanwhile, Prince Menshikov with his field army outside the city tried to break the siege by attacking the Allied flanks. On 25th of October 1854, the Battle of Balaclava took place, a battle remembered for two legendary British military moments. The first was the Thin Red Line, when the 93rd Scottish Highlanders, numbering only about 500 men, stood 2 by 2 and repelled a charge by a much larger Russian cavalry force. Shortly afterwards, the British Heavy Cavalry Brigade made a spectacular charge, routing a much larger Russian cavalry force. But this battle is best remembered for a disaster. Due to a misinterpreted order, the British Light Cavalry Brigade, consisting of about 670 horsemen, was ordered to attack the wrong position. Instead of attacking a possible artillery emplacement, they galloped straight into a valley surrounded by Russian artillery on 3 sides. The Valley of Death. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. They need not reply, they need not ask why, they must only do and die. Into the Valley of the Dead, 600 rode. It was an act of insane courage, a demonstration of absolute discipline. They reached the Russian artillery, slaughtered the gunners, but were then overwhelmed and forced to retreat by the same deadly road. In just 20 minutes, more than half the brigade was out of action. The light cavalry charge was a complete military failure, but it became an immortal symbol of courage and sacrifice, immortalized in Alfred Tennyson's poem. Less than 2 weeks later, the Russians made another attempt to relieve the siege, this time a surprise attack on the British position on the Inkerman Plateau on a foggy early morning. The Battle of Inkerman was a chaotic affair, a battle of soldiers, where small units fought hand-to-hand in dense fog. Once again, the power of the Minié rifle and the tenacity of the British infantry, supported by timely French support, repelled the Russian attack, but both sides suffered terrible casualties. After Inkerman, hopes of a quick victory were all but gone. And then came the most devastating enemy of all, winter. The Allies were completely unprepared. A terrible storm in November sank ships carrying winter uniforms, tents, and medical supplies. Soldiers faced cold, avalanches, and mud in tattered summer uniforms. Disease, cholera, dysentery, typhus, and gangrene were more devastating than enemy bullets. Thousands died from disease and deprivation. The siege of Sevastopol had become a war for survival, and news of the appalling conditions, first telegraphed by war correspondents, caused a wave of outrage at home that threatened to topple the British government. The Crimean War was not just a clash of empires, it was also a revolution in information. For the first time in history, the public at home could follow the progress of a war in almost real time. New inventions such as the steamship and the telegraph shortened the distance between the battlefield and the living room. Newspapers from Crimea could reach London in weeks, sometimes days instead of months. And this created a new force that could shape the war: public opinion. No one had more influence than William Howard Russell, a reporter for the Times. Russell was no army propagandist. He traveled through the camps, interviewed ordinary soldiers, and unsparingly recorded what he saw. Not only the bravery on the battlefield, but also the incompetence of generals, the chaos of logistics, and the appalling conditions the soldiers endured during the first winter. His articles caused a political storm in Britain. He wrote of soldiers dying more from disease than from enemy fire, of wounded men left in filthy, inadequate hospitals, of trains loaded with boots for the right foot but none for the left. The British public, accustomed to stories of military glory, now faced a stark and horrific reality. For the first time, The incompetence of the aristocracy that ran the army was exposed to the public. The wave of public outrage led to the downfall of Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen's government in early 1855. It was a watershed moment, a war profoundly affected by what was written in a newspaper. But Russell's articles did more than topple a government. They also sparked a humanitarian movement and led to the birth of another Crimean War legend, Florence Nightingale. Stimulated by Russell's articles, Florence Nightingale, an upper-class woman who had abandoned a life of ease to pursue a career in nursing, led a group of 38 volunteer nurses to the military hospital at Scutari. What she found was a living hell. Soldiers lay on filthy floors, without medicine, without clean bandages, and died more from diseases like cholera and typhus than from their wounds. But the death rate was appalling. With an iron will and extraordinary talent for organization, Nightingale made a revolution. She fought against bureaucracy and the hostility of military doctors to clean hospitals, improve sanitation, provide nutritious food, and care for patients. She was famous for patrolling the corridors at night with a lamp, bringing comfort to dying soldiers, and was affectionately known as the Lady with the Lamp. Thanks to her efforts, the hospital's mortality rate dropped dramatically. Florence Nightingale not only saved thousands of lives, she also laid the foundations for modern nursing and raised the standards of hygiene in military medicine. The Crimean War was also a laboratory for new military technologies, a clash of old and new. The most obvious difference was in infantry weapons. The British and French armies were equipped with the Minier rifle, which was muzzle-loaded but had a rifling and used a new type of bullet. It allowed the average soldier to hit targets at 3 or 4 times the distance of the smoothbore muskets of most Russian armies. This superiority gave them a decisive advantage in open battles such as Alma and Inkerman. At sea, the war saw the beginning of the end of the era of wooden warships. After their wooden fleet was devastated by Russian explosive shells at Sinop, the French developed floating batteries, slow ships covered with heavy iron armor. At the Battle of Kinburn in 1855, these ironclad ships proved virtually immune to Russian artillery, while being able to destroy fortifications ashore. The age of the ironclad had begun. The siege of Sevastopol also became a major artillery duel, pitting old smoothbore guns against new rifled guns, which had longer range and greater accuracy. The Russians also made the first effective use of naval mines to defend their Baltic ports, heralding a new kind of naval warfare. While technology changed, the essence of war remained human endurance. The 349-day siege of Sevastopol turned into a brutal war of attrition. Both sides dug increasingly complex trench systems, moving closer together. Life in the trenches was a hell of mud, relentless shelling and lightning night attacks to capture key fortifications such as Malakoff and Redan. The defense of Sevastopol spawned Russian heroes and legends. A young artillery officer named Leo Tolstoy fought there, and his experiences were recorded in Sevastopol Stories, one of the earliest realistic and anti-war accounts of the war. Meanwhile, the brilliant surgeon Nikolai Pirogov revolutionized field medicine, introducing the use of plaster casts to set broken bones and developing a triage system to save as many lives as possible. While the siege was going on, other fronts were opened. In the Baltic, the Allied fleet blockaded Russian ports and attacked coastal fortresses, but was unable to deliver a decisive blow. In the Caucasus, the Russian army, though scattered, achieved its greatest success of the war when it besieged and captured the strategic Ottoman fortress of Kars in late 1855. In the Pacific, an Anglo-French attack on the port of Petropavlovsk was repelled, but the fate of the war would be decided at Sevastopol. In early 1855, a significant event occurred. Tsar Nicholas I, who had started the war, died of pneumonia, probably brought on by military defeats. His son, Alexander II, ascended the throne and appeared more inclined to seek peace. At the same time, the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont entered the war on the Allied side, sending an expeditionary force to Crimea, not because it had any dispute with Russia, but as a clever diplomatic move to gain a place at the European negotiating table later. After months of bloody fighting, in September 1855, the French made a decisive attack and captured Malakoff, a key fortification that dominated the entire defense of Sevastopol. Without Malakoff, the defense of the city became hopeless. The Russians blew up the ammunition depots, sank the last ships of the Black Sea Fleet, and retreated north of the bay. Sevastopol had fallen, the guns of Crimea finally fell silent. The fall of Sevastopol in September 1855, together with the Russian victory at Kars on the Caucasus front, created a military stalemate. Both sides were exhausted. The Allies had captured their main objective, but they had neither the ability nor the will to advance further into Russian territory. Russia, under the leadership of the new Tsar Alexander II, recognized the need to end a war that was costly and too weak. Under Austrian mediation, peace negotiations were opened. The peace conference took place in Paris in February 1856. Paris, not London or Vienna, was chosen as the venue, a sign of the return of Napoleon III's France as the arbiter of European power. After weeks of negotiations, the Treaty of Paris was signed on March 30th, 1856, formally ending the Crimean War. The terms of the peace treaty were a crushing defeat for Russia. The most important and humiliating provision was the demilitarization of the Black Sea. Russia was forbidden to maintain any naval fleet or fortifications on its coast. The Black Sea Fleet, which Peter the Great and Catherine the Great had so painstakingly built, was no more. Russia's dream of dominating the Black Sea and reaching the Mediterranean was thwarted. Russia also had to abandon its claim to the protectorate of Orthodox subjects in the Ottoman Empire and return Kars to Turkey. In return, the Allies withdrew their troops from Sevastopol and other Russian territories. The treaty also recognized the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire, placing it under the joint protection of the European powers. The principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia were granted greater autonomy, laying the foundations for the eventual creation of Romania. The Danube was declared an international waterway. On the surface, the old order seemed to have been restored, but in reality, the Crimean War created deep fissures and irreversible changes in European politics. The war's greatest geopolitical consequence was the collapse of the Concert of Europe, the system of conservative alliances that had maintained peace between the great powers since Napoleon. The backbone of that system was the alliance between the two most reactionary powers, Russia and Austria. But Austria's ungrateful neutrality in the war left Russia feeling deeply betrayed. The rift between Russia and Austria fractured the conservative bloc in the east, creating a new power vacuum and diplomatic flexibility. It was in this vacuum that the two greatest national unification movements of the 19th century would arise: the unification of Italy and Germany. The Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, although it played only a minor military role, achieved its objectives. Prime Minister Cavour won a seat at the negotiating table, raised the Italian question, and won Napoleon III's support for his unification campaign. For Napoleon III, the war was a personal victory, strengthening his prestige and position. France once again became the leading power on the continent. Britain, although it had achieved its goal of containing Russia, had paid a heavy price in human lives and finances, and had also discovered the fatal weaknesses of its aristocratic military system. But perhaps the country most deeply affected by the war was the one that lost. Defeat in Crimea was a wake-up call for Russia. It exposed the empire's economic and social backwardness beyond doubt. Tsar Alexander II realized that a state based on serfdom could not compete with the industrialized powers of the West. It was the defeat in Crimea that became the direct impetus for the Great Reforms, culminating in the abolition of serfdom in 1861. Ironically, the military defeat sparked the greatest social modernization in Russian history. The war also had a lasting military legacy. It was a clash of technological generations. The rifled rifle, rear-loading artillery, ironclad warships, mines, and the telegraph all were used and proved important. Military planners around the world learned their lessons. The war demonstrated the need for an efficient logistics system, a strong defense industry, and a professional command structure. But the most tragic legacy of the Crimean War was its human cost. Although it was called a small war compared to later world wars, it was still incredibly brutal. An estimated 500,000 to 600,000 soldiers died, and astonishingly, perhaps 2/3 of them died not from enemy fire, but from disease. Cholera, dysentery, typhus, and typhoid ravaged the crowded and unsanitary barracks. Poor military medicine and a lack of understanding of hygiene turned the war into a humanitarian disaster. It was also the first war to be photographed. Roger Fenton's photographs, though technically limited and unable to capture the live action, brought to the public for the first time true images of battlefields, soldiers, and devastated landscapes. Together with the articles of William Howard Russell, it ushered in a new era where war could no longer be hidden from the public eye. Today, the Crimean War is often forgotten, overshadowed by the larger conflicts of the 20th century. It produced no major territorial changes, and its original causes seem petty and distant, but its legacy still resonates. It is a reminder of the dangers of imperial ambition, the fragility of peace, and the arrogance of leaders who plunge their nations into a war they do not understand. It was a war of contradictions, a war fought with outdated tactics but with modern weapons, a war led by incompetent generals but fought by incredibly brave soldiers. A war that caused untold suffering, but also was the source of great humanitarian advances. On these hills, where soldiers from all over Europe fell, the modern world, with all its complexity and brutality, began to take shape. And it is a lesson we should never forget. The winter of 1854-1855 was not only a disaster for the freezing soldiers in Crimea, but also a blow to the heart of the Russian Empire and its autocratic Tsar. Nicholas I, who had begun the war with an iron confidence in his military might, now faced a harsh reality. The army he considered invincible was pinned down. Sevastopol, the symbol of Russian power on the Black Sea, was under siege, and news of the suffering of the soldiers, of the incompetence of the logistics, reached the capital, causing simmering discontent. For Nicholas, who had spent his life maintaining order and prestige in Russia, this was an unbearable humiliation. His health was rapidly deteriorating. He caught a cold while attending a military parade in freezing weather, but refused to rest. The cold quickly turned into pneumonia. On 2nd March 1855, the prisoner of Europe, the Tsar who had defined an era of reaction, died. Rumors circulated that he had taken poison or had deliberately let himself get sick, unable to face defeat. Whatever the truth, Nicholas III's death marked a major turning point in the war. His son, Alexander II, succeeded him to the throne. Alexander was not like his father. Although he had also received a military education, he was more open-minded and keenly aware of the need for reform. He inherited a war that was on the verge of defeat and an empire teetering on the brink of collapse. Unlike his father, who was bound by honor and stubbornness, Alexander II had the flexibility needed to find a way out. From the start, he sent signals that he was willing to negotiate. The change on the Russian throne had raised hopes of an early peace, but the will to war was still strong on the Allied side, especially in Britain, where a new government led by the fiercely anti-Russian Lord Palmerston had just come to power. However, the Allies also faced problems of their own. The French Emperor Napoleon III was growing impatient with the protracted siege. He had invested too much prestige in the war and needed a decisive victory to strengthen his position. He even considered going to Crimea himself to take command of the army. Meanwhile, a new player had suddenly appeared on the diplomatic chessboard. The Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, a small country in northern Italy, decided to enter the war on the side of the Allies in January 1855. The decision seemed strange. Sardinia-Piedmont had no dispute with Russia, and the war in a distant peninsula seemed irrelevant to their interests. But for their prime minister, a master politician named Camillo Benso, Count Cavour, it was a carefully calculated diplomatic gamble. Cavour understood that the future of Italian unity could not be decided by Sardinia alone. He needed the support of a major power, and he targeted France. By sending 15,000 men to fight and die alongside the British and French in Crimea, Cavour was not simply joining a war, he was buying a ticket to the negotiating table of the European powers. He was demonstrating that Sardinia-Piedmont was a reliable and capable ally. He was laying the groundwork for a future alliance with Napoleon III against Austria, the dominant power in the Italian peninsula. It was a gamble that paid off spectacularly a few years later. The involvement of Sardinia, together with the death of Nicholas I, gave a new impetus to diplomatic efforts. Austria, which was still trying to play the role of mediator, put forward a 4-point peace plan, demanding that Russia renounce its protectorate over the Danube principalities, guarantee freedom of navigation on the Danube, amend the Straits Convention of 1841, and renounce its claim to the protection of Orthodox Christians. Alexander II, albeit reluctantly, accepted these points as a basis for negotiations. A conference was convened in Vienna in March 1855. But negotiations quickly reached a deadlock. The sticking point was the third point, which concerned the end of Russian domination of the Black Sea. Britain and France demanded that Russia strictly limit the size of its naval fleet in the Black Sea. For Russia, this was an intolerable affront, an infringement on national sovereignty. The negotiations collapsed and the war resumed. Both sides now knew that the fate of the war and the terms of the final peace treaty would be decided by the outcome of the siege of Sevastopol. The diplomatic battle was suspended, giving way to a battle of artillery and bayonets. The pressure on the Allied commanders to take the city before another winter set in grew heavier. Napoleon III sent his most talented general, Aimable Pélissier, to take command of the French army. Pélissier was a tough and decisive man, willing to accept casualties to achieve his goals. Under his command, the attacks on Sevastopol's defenses became more methodical and ruthless. The focus of the entire siege now rested on two main fortifications: the Redan, held by the British, and Malakoff, a strategic hill dominating the entire city, targeted by the French. In June 1855, a major Allied attack on both the Redan and Malakoff failed miserably, causing heavy casualties. But Pélissier was undaunted. He ordered his men to dig tunnels and trenches closer and closer to Malakoff. The struggle for every inch of ground was fierce. Meanwhile, on the Baltic front, the Allied fleet continued its blockade and bombardment of Russian fortresses. They succeeded in destroying the fortress of Sveaborg, but were still unable to threaten the main naval base at Kronstadt, protected by minefields. The war in the Baltic remained a secondary, indecisive front. All eyes were on Sevastopol. After months of preparation and heavy bombardment, the final decisive assault was set for 8th of September 1855. The French attack on Malakoff was a spectacular success. They took the fortifications in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, the British attack on the Redan once again failed in disarray. But that no longer mattered. Having lost Malakoff, the lifeblood of their entire defenses, the Russians realized that holding Sevastopol was impossible. That night, under cover of darkness, they began an orderly retreat across a pontoon bridge across the bay, blowing up what remained of the fortifications and sinking the last ships of the Black Sea fleet. The 349-day siege was over. Sevastopol had fallen. The path to peace talks in Paris was open, summer 1855. The siege of Sevastopol was entering its 11th month. What the Allies had hoped would be a lightning campaign had now turned into a brutal war of attrition, a clash of wills and endurance. Both sides had paid a terrible price. Tens of thousands had died, not only from shells and bayonets, but also from disease and cold, but neither side would back down. The fate of the war depended on the outcome of the final battle for the city. After the failure of the June offensive, the new French commander, General Aimable Pélissier, changed tactics. Instead of hasty frontal assaults, he adopted a more systematic, ruthless, and effective method of encirclement. He ordered his engineers to dig an ever-dense network of trenches, which approached the Russian fortifications like the tentacles of an octopus. His ultimate target was Malakoff. Malakoff was more than a fortification. It was the key to the entire defense of Sevastopol. Perched on a commanding hill, Malakoff's guns could fire on almost every other position of both defenders and attackers. With Malakoff in their grasp, the Allies could bring their artillery up there and turn the rest of the city into an undefendable inferno. Opposite Malakoff was the Redan, another formidable V-shaped fortification, which was assigned to the British for attack. Both sides understood that the final battle would be decided at these two locations. Throughout July and August, the trench warfare raged relentlessly. It was a war of miners and engineers, of night raids, of grenades and close quarters fighting. The French, with their experience of siege warfare from their North African colonies, were superior. They had dug their trenches to an astonishing distance, less than 25 meters from Malakoff. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander II, desperate to save Russia's honor, ordered his commander in Crimea, Prince Gorchakov, to make a last-ditch effort to relieve Sevastopol from the outside. Gorchakov assembled his remaining field forces for an attack on the French and Sardinian positions on the Chernaya River. The Battle of the Chernaya, fought on 16th of August, was a disaster foretold. The Russians attacked bravely but uncoordinated, charging straight into concentrated Allied rifle and artillery fire. The Sardinians, in their first major battle, fought brilliantly. By the end of the day, the Russians had been repulsed with terrible casualties. Over 8,000 dead and wounded. The last attempt to relieve the siege had failed. Now the fate of Sevastopol was sealed. It was only a matter of time. The Allies were planning the final assault. In early September, they launched the most intense preparatory artillery bombardment of the entire war. For 3 days straight, more than 800 guns rained a storm of fire and steel on the Russian fortifications, reducing them to piles of rubble and corpses. At midday on 8th of September, the attack whistle sounded. The French, commanded by General McMahon, rushed out of their trenches and covered the short distance to Malakoff in a few minutes. The attack was perfectly timed, just after the Russians had changed guard. The French stormed the fortification and, after a fierce hand-to-hand fight, took it. McMahon raised the tricolor on top and sent the famous message to headquarters: "J'y suis, j'y reste." I am here. I will stay here. Meanwhile, the British attack on the Redan was a different story. Delayed and ill-prepared, they had to cross a much wider gap under heavy fire. Although some units captured part of the fortifications, they were disorganized, lacked command, and were not reinforced in time. The Russians counterattacked and drove the British back, inflicting heavy casualties. Once again, the British suffered a bitter defeat. But the defeat at Redan no longer mattered. From the top of Malakoff, French artillery could now fire directly at the remaining Russian positions. Prince Gorchakov realized that further defense would be suicidal. That night, he ordered a brilliant retreat under cover of darkness. More than 90,000 Russian troops quietly withdrew across a pontoon bridge nearly a kilometer long across the bay to the north of the city. They blew up ammunition depots, destroyed fortifications, and sank the last ships. The next morning, the Allies entered a ruined, burning, and deserted Sevastopol. The fall of Sevastopol was the decisive blow of the war, but the conflict continued on other fronts, often overshadowed by events in the Crimea. In the Baltic Sea, in the summer of 1855, the Allied fleet launched a massive bombardment of the naval fortress of Sveaborg near Helsinki. Although it inflicted considerable damage, it was unable to capture it. The blockade continued to cripple Russian trade, but it could not deliver a knockout blow. Ironically, Russia's greatest military success of the entire war came in the final months, and on a distant front. In the Caucasus, a Russian army under General Muravyov besieged the strategic Ottoman fortress of Kars. Cut off from all supplies and abandoned by the Western Allies, the Turkish garrison, under British officers, resisted bravely for months. But finally, ravaged by famine and disease, they were forced to surrender in November 1855. The capture of Kars gave Russia a significant bargaining chip in the forthcoming peace negotiations. But these minor successes could not conceal the fact that Russia had lost the war. The fall of Sevastopol, combined with economic exhaustion and the threat of Austrian intervention, forced Tsar Alexander II to seek peace. The last guns in Crimea had fallen silent. The war, which had begun with imperial ambitions and religious disputes, ended in exhaustion for all sides. It left a legacy of nearly 500,000 dead, a changed political map of Europe, and a series of military lessons that would shape future conflicts. Now, diplomats will gather in Paris to decide the fate of a fragile peace built on the ashes of the first modern war. Paris, spring 1856. While soldiers were still dying of disease in field hospitals, European diplomats gathered to shape a new peace. The Paris Conference was a glittering affair, a return to old-style diplomacy, where the fates of nations were decided behind closed doors. For Emperor Napoleon III, holding the conference was a huge personal triumph, confirming France's return as the arbiter of European power. The negotiations proceeded relatively quickly. All sides were tired of war. Russia, under the new Tsar Alexander II, knew it had lost and needed to cut its losses. Britain and France, though having achieved their main military objectives, were reluctant to get bogged down in a protracted war on Russian soil. Austria, fearing isolation, played an active mediating role to push for an agreement. After a month, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the Crimean War. The terms of the treaty were a clear defeat for Russia. The most important and humiliating provision was the demilitarization of the Black Sea. Russia was forbidden to maintain any naval fleet or fortifications on its coast. Russia's dream of dominating the Black Sea and advancing into the Mediterranean was blocked for at least a generation. Russia also had to abandon its claim to the protectorate of Orthodox subjects in the Ottoman Empire and return the fortress of Kars, its only bargaining chip. In return, The Allies withdrew their troops from Sevastopol and other Russian territories. The treaty also recognized the territorial integrity and independence of the Ottoman Empire, placing it under the joint protection of the European powers. This was an attempt to maintain the sick man of Europe as a buffer zone. The principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia were granted full autonomy, laying the foundations for the birth of Romania. The Danube River was open to commercial shipping of all nations. On the surface, the old order seemed to have been restored and Russia's ambitions curbed, but the real consequences of the Crimean War were much deeper and more lasting than what was written on paper. The most important geopolitical consequence was the collapse of the concert of Europe. Since the time of Napoleon, a war of peace in Europe had been maintained by a balance of power based on the cooperation of 5 conservative powers. The pillar of that system was the Holy Alliance between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, but Austria's ungrateful neutrality in the war, threatening to intervene against Russia, completely destroyed that relationship. Russia felt betrayed and would never forgive Austria. The rift between the 2 conservative Eastern powers created a power vacuum and instability in Central Europe. It was in this vacuum that the 2 great national unification movements of the 19th century, those of Italy and Germany, would find their opportunity to rise, led by Cavour and Bismarck, who had watched and learned from the war. For the belligerents, the war had different legacies. Napoleon III's France gained prestige and influence. Britain, while achieving its strategic goal of containing Russia, paid a heavy price and recognized fatal weaknesses in its military system, leading to a series of reforms. The Ottoman Empire, though nominally victorious, continued to decline and internal reforms failed, leaving the Eastern question intact. But the nation most profoundly affected by the war was the one that lost. Defeat in Crimea was a wake-up call for Russia. It was not just a military defeat, but a brutal exposure of the systemic backwardness of a huge empire. Tsar Alexander II realized that a state based on serfdom, with weak industry and a corrupt bureaucracy, could not compete in the modern world. It was the defeat in Crimea that became the irresistible impetus for the great reforms, culminating in the abolition of serfdom in 1861. In an ironic way, the military defeat sparked the greatest social modernization in Russian history, though those reforms were ultimately not enough to save the Romanov dynasty. The Crimean War also left an indelible legacy in military history. It was a transitional war, a bloody bridge between the Napoleonic era and the industrial warfare of World War I. For the first time, railways played a strategic role in transporting troops and supplies. The telegraph allowed governments and newspapers to communicate almost instantaneously with the battlefield. The importance of rifled rifles, modern artillery, and ironclad warships was indisputably demonstrated. It also offered a horrifying lesson in the cost of neglecting military logistics and medicine. And that is the most tragic legacy of the Crimean War, the human cost. More than 500,000 lives were lost. And astonishingly, perhaps 2/3 of them died not from enemy fire, but from disease. Cholera, dysentery, typhus, and gangrene ravaged the unsanitary barracks. The suffering of ordinary soldiers, widely reported for the first time in the press, sparked a new sense of humanitarian responsibility. The pioneering efforts of Florence Nightingale and medical workers like Nikolai Pirogov laid the foundations for modern nursing and the later Geneva Conventions. From the atrocities of war, modern humanity began to take shape. Today, the Crimean War is often seen as a strange and forgotten conflict, fought for obscure reasons in a faraway place. It had no blitzkrieg or great conquests. It was a war of mud, disease, and incompetence. But it was in that mess and misery that the modern world began to take shape. It shattered the old European order, sparked social reforms, changed the way war was waged, and brought the naked truth of battle to the public for the first time. On these hills, where soldiers from all over Europe fell for the honor of kings and empires, a crucial lesson was written in blood. In modern warfare, the greatest enemy is often not the army on the other side of the trenches, but disease, privation, and the arrogance of the leaders themselves. And that is a legacy, a warning, that remains true today. The Crimean War is a forgotten conflict, but it was the birthplace of many aspects of modern warfare, from the role of journalism to nursing to new military technologies. Which legacy of this war do you think has had the greatest impact on our world today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Dear us. Your discussion will help shed light on these forgotten pages of history, and if you find stories like this valuable, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can continue exploring the wars that shape the world.